Hey class, in this video we're going to talk about React Router. Here's the example that we've been working on all month, Instabook. We have our links on the left hand side, newsfeed, messages, and watch. On the right hand side we have the profile or settings tab along with the user's name and avatar photo. What we're going to do is implement React routing in order to get the links to work in between the newsfeed, the messages, the watch page, and then also the profile setting. And your profile should go in here. Let's go back to the newsfeed. Originally, this was your app.js file. We are now going to change this and redirect it to a new page called newsfeed. You can also see that in the URL link above. The first thing that we're going to need to do is go to React Router, click the web link, come over here and do your npm install. I'm sorry, you should already have this create React app. We've done that already. That's what you've been working on. So what you need to do is actually come down here and do the npm install React Router DOM. Over here there's a bunch of links and URLs that I explained in the previous video if you want to go back through and look at all of that. But this video we're just going to talk about how to change your project using React Router. Let's go ahead and take a look at the previous project. Here we have your app.js file, the one that you were creating from earlier. What we need to do is duplicate this file and go ahead and rename it because we're going to reuse this in a different way. First thing you want to do is come up to your source folder. In the source folder, we're going to create a new folder called Pages. The pages are where the whole views are going to lie. So one for the newsfeed, one for the messages, one for the watch page, and then one for the profile page. On the app.js, what we're going to do first is go ahead and duplicate that file. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the file. I'm going to call this newsfeed.js. I am going to place this file in the pages folder. Now what we need to do is go back to the app.js file and make some changes to this. The first part that we're going to do is actually remove all of the old information. We're just going to leave the class and we're going to do some exports down here in the render. Now that we've removed all of the information from inside of the class component, you can see that we have class app and then we're doing the export down here to export the actual app out. We're going to need to add React routing to the main file in order to get the routes to appear wherever we want them to be displayed. Let's go back to the documentation on React Router. Make sure you do the npm install React Router DOM. Once you do that, there will be a new file in your application in the node modules folder. If you scrolled all the way down, obviously to the R's, you'll want to look for the React Router DOM file, which should be in here right there. React Router and React Router DOM. Make sure you have both of those. If you do not have them, then it will cause an error and you will not be able to get your routing to work correctly. Let me close this back up. I just wanted to show you the location. Now let's go back to the app.js. We're going to have to add the following information in order to get the routing to work. The first part of this is we need to bring in the import. So if I were to go to look for the browser router, anytime that we do the main importing, we want to use router to pull in the information and route the views to the appropriate location. If I go to the documentation, you could see here it'll tell you about the basics, but if you scroll down to the API, come down here to browser router, this is where the documentation is going to be. But I'll show you quickly how to go ahead and do that for your app. Come back to your file. We want to include import browser router as router from React DOM. And I'm just simply getting that from the documentation page right here. And it will tell you to import the following. Import browser router as router. If we're using switcher routes, we want to include those. Right now we're not going to actually use that. We'll use the switch later. Let's go back to our file. So we want to go ahead and do the import browser router as a router from the React Router DOM. Once we add that in, we're going to want to include the router as an element within our application. In order to do that, we're going to have to include the router tag itself. So you're going to start off with the return, and you're going to want to wrap the return within the router element. So everything that goes within line 14 is going to be wrapped within the router. Next, we're just going to come back in and add the information like you've had before. You're going to have like a container. Don't forget that all elements in React have to be wrapped within a container. Next, I would bring in my header. The next part is where we're going to have the actual information display. Footer, if you have a footer, but on our application, we have something called ads. So we have our header. We're going to have a navigation on our left-hand side, which you can see here. We have our header. Then we're going to have a navigation here. This is where the routes are going to load. And this is our ad column, where we would have our dynamic ads being injected in. Currently, I do not have the ads set up on this example, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove those for right now. But I did want to go ahead and just show you how it would work. You also want to make sure that you import the components into the top of the application. So here you're seeing I'm importing header and I'm importing routes. That way all of our routes will be displayed. Now the next thing that you're going to need to do in order to get this to work correctly is to create a file called routes. If you go into your components folder, create a new file, and we're going to call it route.js. The route file is where we're going to have the views displayed in our application. The very first thing that you need to do is you need to import React Route and React Switch from React Router DOM. You're going to also want to import any of the route file locations that you're going to use. So for instance, we're now going to have import newsfeed from pages/newsfeed. And that way we can go ahead and use the newsfeed as well. I'm going to go ahead and change page 1 to, let's go ahead and make that be the next one called messages. I'm going to change this to messages. Third one would be watch. I'm going to change this to watch. And then the fourth one would be your actual profile. We'll go profile here. Perfect. The next part, we're going to want to actually switch the views or the routes. Come back to the documentation. If you scroll down, you should see something called switch. This will give you more of an explanation of why we would use switch versus some of the other techniques that are used. Once again, we're going to always want to have it wrapped within a container tag. I'm going to use section for this. You can also use fragment if you wanted to use something that didn't actually have a container, like a div, for instance. You would use fragment. But let's go ahead and throw the switch in. We're also going to include this path here, route. Route exact path / is going to load right to the root page. So whatever page you want it to be the initial load is going to go to this component here. It could be your home page. For this example, it would actually be our newsfeed. So we're going to go ahead and do newsfeed. Here I'm going to now change this to messages. And then the component needs to match because that's what we called it in the previous files. You're going to see in a minute once we create it. Messages, watch, watch, and then the last one should be profile. Okay. Perfect. Now right now you're seeing that I have some warnings going on here. Can't resolve messages. That's because we actually haven't set up the files yet. You can see in my pages file I have 3 pages created, but we need to go ahead and make those match these routes. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename mine real quick. Rename this one's going to be messages. Rename this one. It will be watch. And then I'm going to rename this one. And it's going to be profile. If you've done everything correctly, you should have a pages folder. In the folder, you should have 4 files, one for the messages, one for the newsfeed, which was your original app.js page, your profile, and now your watch. Let's go back to the route file itself. Make sure you also do your export because it is a class. You want to make sure that you include the links in the head and make sure you include that import statement. Once you have all of that, this information here is going to be loaded into this component so that you could see it on the initial page load. That's going to allow us to now navigate through the individual pages. But let's go ahead and set up the pages so that they work correctly. Here, let's go ahead and start the newsfeed. That's where our old page was with the search information. So instead of it calling app, now I'm just going to rename the name of the class newsfeed. That way it's going to work correctly. You can also see here now I'm getting an error that says app CSS. That's because we changed the file location, so this is not importing correctly anymore. So I'm just going to comment that out real quick. What else do we have here? We may have to update some of this information, like the header. It's no longer being injected in the same way. I'm just going to move on to the following pages just so we can update those right now. Let's go ahead and go to the messages. In here you can see I have a simple class component. I'm going to now change it. I did have it named page 1, but now I'm going to change it to have it called messages. And in here I'm just going to say messages. Okay. And typically you would do something like an H1 tag or something like that, depending on how you want it styled. Same thing with the profile. I'm going to change this to the profile class. Same thing with the watch. All right, I believe that looks like everything. Right now we have all of the files changed. The route location is going to the appropriate route. However, we still need to create a way to get to the routes. And normally we would do that by creating a navigation. In the previous week, you did create a navigation component. You can go back in and use that actual component. I have my component right here, nav.js. In order to get the links to work correctly, you have to use a component piece called navlink. If you go back to the documentation, navlink here, and you also have link. So I use navlink obviously when there's a navigation involved, when you want to redirect it using a navigation. If you wanted to redirect to an outside location, maybe like google.com or something like that, you would want to use the link tag. If you want to use it within the application, you should use the navlink. I'm going to show you a simple way to use it. Come to your navigation.js component. We're going to do an import of navlink from React Router DOM. In here, you should have a class or a constant. I would typically have it as a constant if I had no functionality going on. So really, this should be a constant with the name of nav. In here, we're going to return a navigation and the links within the navigation. So here, we're going to use the component called navlink. We're going to say to, which is going to be the location of the actual button itself. So where do you want that button to go? Which component? That component, I want to go to the newsfeed. And I'm also going to change it here, newsfeed. You can see I have a typo, so it will not actually work until I fix that right there. Second one will be messages. I'm going to change, this is what's displayed on the page, messages. Here will be the watch. Maybe I could type. And I'm going to do this one more time for the profile. Which the profile and the way we have it laid out is laid out different. My profile was here instead of on the actual navigation bar. So I would actually put my nav link here versus actually having it on the navigation here. But for this demo purpose, I'm actually just going to throw it right here, just so that you can see how to do it. Go profile and profile. I'm going to go back to the app.js page, and we have it set up a little different. So I'm going to remove the header from here so that my other elements are working correctly. So let me just remove that from the app.js file. Right now, I would lay this out different if it was the application, but just for the tutorial purposes, I'm going to inject my navigation component. I need to also import it up here. I don't really like the way that brings it in, but it always brings it in at the bottom for some reason. I'm going to import the nav from the component nav. Let's save it. If everything works correctly, you should see something that says compiled successfully. However, I know you're going to get an error because of your newsfeed page. You're going to need to update all of the information in there to match the new location settings. But for right now, just for testing purposes alone, we're going to have the container, I'm going to have a navigation, and I'm going to have the routes being loaded. I'm going to refresh, which you don't need to do. It should automatically refresh by itself. But here you can see I have the newsfeed link, which will cause an error because we don't have that working right now. We have the messages, which you can now see load. We have the watch, which if I come back in here and actually change it, that was linked to here. Let's go ahead and say watch. And you can see I saved it and now it automatically updates watch. So new messages, watch, profile. Newsfeed is going to cause an error right now because we have that commented out. So messages, watch, and profile. So if you have everything working correctly, your new routes should be loading the proper views once the navigation button is clicked. Because of us moving the file location from the app.js to now the newsfeed, you will have to come in here and update some of the links and some of the information depending on the new file locations. But once you update all of that, that should resolve any issues that you have. If you have any other questions about React Router DOM, just come back to the documentation and read up all on the API links themselves. By the end of this week, you should have all of the components working properly. You should have the search box working, you should have the local storage, you should have some messages pulled in. Mine's not styled that great right now, but what I would do is a static list with your logo, or I should say with the user's avatar, the information here, and then also a delete button, because anytime you have messages, you're always going to want to delete those messages. Now, if I hit refresh, you can see that I do have local storage added onto that as well. If I wanted to go back to the original state, I would just go inspect, application, local storage. All right, I don't know why that's up there, but there we go. So let's go ahead and clear all of those out. If I hit refresh now, you should see my messages load back. And there they are. So I have the user's name, their information, the time and date, and also an avatar for them. All right, class, that concludes this discussion about React Router. If you have any questions, just always ask me on Slack.